So it's no surprise that many of us believe that while big data has a lot of potential, it also sometimes seems to be a big lie, right? And it's hard to deal with. Now, if we think about what we are faced with, there's a huge glut of data that is coming out there. And today we're going to talk about how we are using that data to actually create rich experiences. So I'll start by introducing ourselves. I am Subbu. I lead integrated marketing analytics and insights at Team Detroit. And I've been there for about 2 years. Most of my experience actually has been at the intersection of data, strategy, and analytics.
Great. I'm Mike Baker, the co-founder and CEO of DataZoo. My background actually is, prior to doing DataZoo and big data, is actually mobile. So I was with Nokia and sort of an early pioneer in mobile marketing before that, a company called nPocket.
Siraj Barwani, I'm the chief of all the analytics and insights that we do. And the unique aspect of the data set that we look at, which is the world's largest data set for opt-in consumption, which is across content. So all the content that Ford creates and other creates, speed dating and go further stories and all of those are all content which users opt in to decide whether they want to watch or not. So those are the data sets that we deal with in figuring out how to create experiences around that.
My name is Scott Lang. I'm a group creative director at Google. Most recently, in my recent past, I was a senior creative leader and executive creative director at Team Detroit as well. So my background as a senior agency creative is what puts me on this panel, and was responsible for a lot of the Ford work in the digital space.
Andy Martin. I'm a planning director at Team Detroit. So part of my role is typically in the agency world, it's been very siloed between analytics, strategy, and creative. And my role is kind of to see how those roles can come and combine together so that it's not only on the back end of looking at the data and analytics, but it's also using the data up front to help develop the strategies that come through so that for our clients, the strategies we develop are very clearly data-driven, that they're adaptive and flexible, and that we can put our clients in better position to kind of pivot with the market as we move forward.
Thanks, Andy. So I thought we'd kick off this discussion just by dissecting what we are facing. So clearly, I think we're facing a deluge of data. Just to put this into context, over the course of the last 10 years, the amount of data that's being generated has not only grown exponentially, but has actually exploded. Today, every single day, we actually produce more data than all of the human words ever spoken in humanity. So that's every day. And by the end of 2015, we will have produced as much data as about 100,000 times the amount of data stored by the Library of Congress. So now I think the question is, where is all this data coming from? And I think it's important to understand that most of the data that we talk about as big data is actually coming from two distinct sources. One is devices, like cars, which increasingly have a ton of sensors in them. In fact, a recent McKinsey study pointed out that cars will be the #2 source of data globally by the end of 2015. The second are humans. And through the course of our interactions with other people, with devices, with different platforms, social platforms, sharing images, sharing videos, sharing content, we are proliferating a lot of data. So those are the two key sources of data. Now, marketers have been dealing with data for decades. So it's dealing with data is not new, but what's new is historically we've always dealt with data at rest. Now it's data in motion. It's data with velocity, high volume data. And most of this data, 85% of it is actually unstructured. Only 25% of it can be used if tagged. And most of all, it is anonymous. So the question is, how are marketers actually kind of dealing with this velocity of data, the volume of data, and would love to kind of get your thoughts on it, Mike.
Sure, well, I'll kick that off because that's sort of what keeps us busy all day, is dealing with the sort of flumes of data coming in. So just to size it, so DataZoo is a company focused on programmatic marketing. The idea is to use data and analytics and sort of like a scientific approach to understanding, creative consumer context. And, while that's not a new problem, it's a new approach. that's given rise from the consumer data coming out of the devices of the digital lifestyle. So what is the data? It's literally log lines of data coming from anonymous browse activity of various sorts. We're, to put this in perspective, DataZoo, who works with Team Detroit and Ford and a number of other brands around the world, we're seeing on average about 100 events per person per week of everyone connected to the internet. We are, right? So that winds up being about 30 terabytes of data a day. And it's all anonymous. It has this kind of crazy string of data on a log line. And what companies like DataZoo is doing is like unpacking this. So we're unpacking one sort of 2K of data and like putting it into 80K of tables that talk about the creative concept, the context of what's happening with this device and where it is, looking at the IP address, as well as understanding the cross-device identity of the consumers and sort of trying to piece together the dots of behavior. So two things that are our focal point. One is you can use all this information for better targeting messages. So right message, right person at the right time. And the ad tech industry spent a lot of time on that. Some would say too much. What's great about this panel, we're going to talk about creative, because that's the great unexplored area of like, well, how do you use this data beyond targeting? And the second area that's of interest is just using all this data to understand what happened. Because the way advertisers and marketers and product designers typically have researched that is by a survey, right? And sitting behind the two-way mirror, asking people about a product. Well, people say different things than they actually do. And I think what's really fascinating now is we have this incredible like live real-time science lab to actually gauge after we expose somebody to something, does their behavior change? And let's do a control exposed and see if the exposed population, their internet behavior, which is now just their behavior because everything's connected, it should be inflected somehow. And I think that measurement area from the behavioral data is a second area of real potential that's underdeveloped.
That's a great point, especially around the dichotomy between targeting and content. Siraj?
So if you move from the world where, if you look at it, this is something you may have heard before. As a brand, you can speak as loud as you want, but if the listener isn't paying attention, you've essentially miserably failed to communicate the message. Plain and simple, right? Not to even talk about actions that you want them to take. Content, especially consumption that happens on demand, with opt-in, is really the most rich source of information by which you can establish whether somebody is really paying attention to whatever it is you offered them to do. In particular, not just you as a brand communicating and showing options, but everybody else in your space. So if you are talking about mass automotive sector, it's Ford and everybody else who participates and throws content out there, leaves it up to the consumer to figure out whether they want to watch it or not. So in large data sets, your challenge is looking for the signal. What is it that you pay attention to in this ocean of data, right? So I wanted to give you one illustrative idea. We call this share of attention. So if you have a brand and it has some video content out there and people are paying attention and watching some aspect of it, how much attention is your brand getting relative to everybody else in your category? Now, why does it matter? It's because it's all relative. How much consumption you drive is not alone important, but also what the rest of the market is doing, and we refer to that as share of attention, across 23 different verticals. Over the last 7 years, we have seen for a specific share of attention, potentially over certain percentages, depending on which vertical it is, it directly drives sales lift, which means share of sales in a quarter is dependent on how much attention you got on a relative scale. And that's example of Subbu to answer, while we can be swimming in data as much as we want, it's the signals we as brands care most about. Is it ultimately getting somebody to buy the product? And that's where we go.
So in this mountain of data that we're talking about, I'm here to provide the creative perspective on this. And typically, in years past, especially when media was much more traditionally focused and much less measurable, you wouldn't hear us talking about. You wouldn't hear a creative lead up here talking about data. It was, it usually elicits eye rolls from people. It's like, oh, we have to go test the stuff that we're going to do. Whatever. Let's just let's get on with the work. To be successful in this space now, we have to embrace that math part, the science behind the art that we create. And so in this mountain of data that, like Sabu's first slide, however many the exabytes of data that people produce, all the ones and zeros that people leave on the ground when we walk around and when we drive and when we surf on the internet, there's a few different ways to look at that data. We quite often talk about data as validation for ideas that we're doing. Did it work? Did the ad that we produced work? Did the piece of technology that we produced, did people use it? I don't know. Should we do it again or should we not do it again? That's an important way to look at data, but I would argue that an equally important way to look at that data, very same data through a different lens, is to look at it as inspiration for ideas. We spend a lot of time validating ideas that we have, but there's a well of inspiration in that data set too that can send creative teams, creative thinkers, creative strategists off in very different directions, very unexpected directions. Those are always the best times for me as a creative, is when we're surprised by data. Like Andy can talk about it, but I know like on the agency side, when we were working together, I quite often asked when the strategy team would bring work to us or bring the groundwork for our creative teams to launch, I'd ask them for the anomalies. What were the anomalies in the data that you shaved off? Like, what are the ends of the bell curve that you shaved off? Because there are stories trapped in those little tails that are there. If you get too close to the middle of that curve, everybody starts to look alike. And we're not talking to, like, this is, the work that we do in the digital space is niche marketing. It's all niche marketing. Some of it are giant niches, or some of them are very small niches that are grouped together, so there's millions of them, so they look like mass, but they're not. We're trying to be relevant to people on an almost one-to-one basis.
Great. Yeah, so I think what's exciting to me is the more that some of the data that had previously been sort of hidden from us or was restricted, so all this sort of open market, open source data is allowing us to basically, you can get dazzled by the amount that's there, but you can also start to focus and say, I basically have my choice of any sort of data set, and I can put those and collide those things together to come up with an insight that was never there in the past because you had this missing element. So the last panel that we had actually shows one of those surprising sources of people who are inspiring us to actually find the interesting pieces within the data that we can create change with. So the last panel was about how political campaigns are actually showing marketers and brands how to achieve success. So what's interesting about that is you can actually dive in and find the persuadable audiences, which don't need to be massive. They can be small audiences that would have a very big impact on your brand, and you can now locate them. You can find them geographically, you can find them through psychographics, and that allows you to go after distinct audiences and provide very unique and very specialized messages. So it's fracturing to some degree, but it's also helping you sort of fight many battles for the brand at one time. And to me, that's pretty exciting. One of the other more inspiring examples, I think, of using that data comes from this notion of the data being open to everyone now. So there was one of the data scientists in New York, I don't know, you guys may have seen this story, but he was able to find the worst parking space in the entirety of Manhattan. So he basically took parking fine data, he took all the geographic data, and he was able to locate one particular parking spot, which generated close to 65 to 70% of the revenue that the city was amassing. And when he actually went to that location, he found that fire hydrant was very hard to see next to that parking spot. So everyone was parking in this spot and had no idea. So it was this sort of trick kind of black hole, and everyone was very upset with, obviously, the fines that they were amassing. So that turned into real sort of personal action. So wrote a letter to the city, basically exposed this, and 3 weeks later, this parking spot was, cordoned off, so there was no parking available at that point. So it's really interesting how, like, just taking that data, kind of diving into it, allows you to create a pretty compelling change just with one little thing. And that sort of inspiration of, governments, cities that are getting the data, that to me is an example that even marketers and brands can look at to say, we need to be more thoughtful, we need to be more clever with how we sort of combine these different data sets to come up with some compelling change.
Yeah, I think Andy, your point about combining data sets is really critical, because I think one of the frameworks we tend to use is data, information, and knowledge, right? And we apply this, in our work on a day-to-day basis, because data by itself, or raw data, is very hard to use, right? So data needs to be linked, and one of the things we did is we did a study where we linked online consumer behaviors to sales data to understand, fundamentally, kind of, I think, starting with the question of understanding what drives purchase behavior and what drives sales. So we took the raw data around clickstream behaviors, linked it to sales to create information and patterns, and understanding the patterns around how people shopped and how people bought, which actually yielded knowledge around, through modeling, yielded knowledge around the behaviors that were most likely to actually drive purchase. And through that, now we're able to not only kind of evaluate the performance of audiences, but also the performance of creative, right? And know, for example, what publishers and what creative actually kind of drives purchase intent. That's, I think that's a great example. Now, I think one of the things, one of the questions that come to mind is, as we kind of talk about data, and big data especially, marketers and advertisers are all about the big idea, right? Big ideas win the big awards. That's what gets the industry accolades. So how does the concept of big data tie with the big idea in your minds?
I'll take a shot at that first. I think the big idea is just a relic at this point. To me, it's mass marketing, and I think mass marketing is a relic increasingly. These are constructs that come out of a time when there weren't many media sources. Consumers had no choice. It was like a one-way dialogue. It was TV, radio, and print. And in some ways, it's like still, this vestigial limb in this industry that kind of keeps doing what it used to do well. So let me reformulate this a little bit. I think the big idea is alive for a mass marketing campaign, and that has a role. But like that space has been totally explored. And I think there's a lot of unexplored space as you get closer to the individual person. And the question is, like, how does any of this advertising or marketing, like, where's the relevance to individual people? And I think the data can help there. So for me, the big idea is a lot of little ideas. And you're going to have pockets of people, it was your example, that behave very differently. And what I'm seeing is the data and analytics folks, people like DataZoo, were there with going from one consumer persona to 5 segments to 200 micro segments. You can map all that out pretty easily in this sort of like quantitative data-driven world. But now I'm going to hand it back to you guys and go, okay, for these 200 micro segments, there's different creative engagement behaviors, or even the ways they use the internet or their mobile phones. And so the challenge is, and I think the industry's kind of stuck on this, honestly, is how do I create experiences, design experiences, UI, UX, that actually map down at those granular sort of pockets. I don't like the word microsegments, but let's call them microsegments for the time being. So do I need to create 200 different executions? Or do I need to create creative that's different for each closed environment that is a native, like Pinterest, right? And that's kind of what, some people are doing that, but it's like, how can I marry, this sort of data-driven approach to the creative? And one thing I'd like to put on the table, maybe I'll stop talking, but for a subsequent question, is this idea of creative primitives. We talk about this in data centers, there are primitives, which are architectural building blocks behind how you render out a computing service. and they're modular, right? So I'd love to see the creative industry get like, more into this like creative primitives concept, where any marketing message can be like broken down into 8 constituent components and assembled in this like sentient, like on the fly, at the speed of life way, depending on what the person is doing. And it's a total inversion. It's not what the brand thinks, it's actually what the person is doing, and the brand sort of, renders in a way that's relevant or not at all.
The idea, I think, of creative primitives is interesting, and we talked about this a little bit before. It makes me shudder a little bit when we talk about that, because it's like, the idea of a giant robot like creating creative work is, I think removing the human element from a lot of that is actually, and I've run across this a lot in the digital space, where I think people sometimes we try to over-automate things, and it removes some of the special qualities of what we do in the creative space. So as long as there's room to augment that, something like that, I would totally agree. Like if we have building blocks that we could build, but then leave room and resources and money and production funds to be able to optimize in real time as we see data, and that's one of the biggest challenges I think any of us have is being able to do that.
Let me, if I can, just to press on this a little bit. So there's the brand losing control to a machine, but here's another version of that. Let's talk about the people who create the experiences that Uber or Snapchat or what have you, that people enjoy. My idea is like this creative primitives or Google could actually help them as the sort of the assemblers of audiences render in the idea the right way. So in other words, you're actually ceding some creative control to the audience owner and a little bit less to the marketer. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I totally buy into that. Like the idea of ceding control a little bit of brand work. I think that's a necessity in in this area, and that's actually it's another thing that we traditionally struggle with a lot as people who want to control. Marketers who want to control the message of their brand are just now coming to the idea that that the brand is really what people tell you it is, not necessarily what you tell those people that brand is. And so the brand is about the perception that it has in the online space. I'm speaking mostly about the online space, but I think that back to the big idea thought. I had thought about it, and I totally agree with the lots of little ideas. I almost think it's big ideas in plural, though, because even the little ideas that we have in the online spaces, like the niches that we play in, are big. Like we have so much reach there. I used to say a lot. The idea of the big ideas when there was less measurability of things, and we could only relate to whether or not something shook the cultural zeitgeist that we did. Like when an ad was produced, did people talk about it at work the next day? And that was the idea. Like, well, shoot, if they did that, then you must have made it. Like if you hit that many people's conscious at some sense, then that was a big idea. That was something that spread like wildfire. I think now that's sort of a remnant. The idea of the big idea. I'm using the word idea too much, but which is hard when you're doing it. So that big idea is sort of this remnant of when scale was like the main measure of success. And I would challenge and say that although scale is very important now in success measures, that we have the ability to measure engagement and how an ad makes somebody react, or how they feel about an ad. The verbatim comments that come, like now there's a two-way dialogue. Like suddenly ads can be commented on. And that thought is really more about engagement. And I often ask that question, is it more important to have 1 million, say you produce a video, is it more important to have 1 million viewers of a video, or is it more important to have 10,000 people that loved it? And I would argue that the 10,000 people, and I'm throwing arbitrary numbers out, but I would argue that the 10,000 people that loved it are far more important than those 1 million people that might have seen it.
Very interesting. Do you have the So here, on the topic of experiences, right, that you create, whether they are mega scale, short scale, small groups that then drive the message out forward and so forth. It was fascinating that Scott and I had an opportunity to work together on this whole idea at the time when Ford was getting ready about 1.5 years ago for a big Super Bowl execution. What you're looking at here is about 7 years worth of data, roughly 350 different mega executions around Super Bowl and big events. If you look at the data set of over 2 billion views across all these executions, you find a very interesting pattern in that data. What do you find? Something that was novel in 2010, that somehow you didn't need to wait for the big day when the ad was run and then something else happened. This year alone in Super Bowl, 550 million views were consumed, combining 3 weeks before the game and 3 weeks after the game, the whole. 300 million of those happened before the game day. So there is a lot of excitement and consumption that happens before the game even starts. So there's a lot of interaction that's happening, and what this is showing is pre-game excitement around watching of videos and talking and so forth. This year it was the Deflate Gate and all that, right? And the brands wanted to be part of the conversation. Then during the game, given how exciting the game was, nobody's taking the time to watch videos. It's all about tweeting and posting, and it's all textual behavior, which is very fast on your mobile device. And then after the game, once again, you're going back to looking at all the assets and content that you want to engage with and so forth. Very distinct behaviors to which, if you go to the next one, you can create unique assets for interaction and experiences. So Scott, I'll let you talk about it, because we talked about that kind of a trend in data, and then your team essentially created experiences to match to that.
Yeah, it was. This was not this past Super Bowl. It was the Super Bowl
before,
prior, and we had a spot, and this was in a past life for me at Team Detroit. But we worked, and based on the data that Suraj had, and actually a lot of marketers were doing this too, where there's a lot of people not waiting for the day of the game and teasing their commercials or throwing their commercials out beforehand. Based on the data that Suraj's team brought forward, we felt the best way to do what we were going to do, because we weren't ready to reveal the message that we were going to send in that spot, in the particular spot, was to create a series of teasers. And we had the spot featured James Franco. But we had we did a whole series of teasers that were these sort of with Rob Riggle, who was the other actor in the spot, and we did a whole series of very short teasers that were these sort of obscure pieces that ran online that were meant to just kind of make a question mark pop up over somebody's head and be like, what in the world is Ford going to do in the Super Bowl? This is something unexpected. They were funny, they were quirky, they were weird. And they drove engagement, and they drove engagement wrapped around a hashtag that was going to be activated during the game, where we did a lot of live tweeting and live social engagement on the game, wrapped around that. The hashtag was nearly double, and it was about the efficiency of the Ford Fusion compared to other average vehicles on the road. We then, executed a live tweeting program, like Suraj was saying, that kind of triggered all of this. We were feeding the hashtag before the game, spot launched on the game, and then we had live events. And actually, a good portion of it was scenario planned before. We left the flexibility to be able to be adaptive, but had a lot of plans in the space. After all, it's a football game, and it kind of starts. The hashtag we were working against was nearly double, so it was fortunate that it was such a blowout against against Denver that Seattle trounced them. So in that sense, it gave us a lot of fodder in the moment. But it was fun to work on, and that's a good example of what I was talking about before. When you look at that data set, once as validation and similar data or same data set as inspiration. That's a good example of, we used the work that Suraj's team had done and the insight that they gave us to inspire us to do certain things before the game that led to our after the game activities. And then we used the data of engagement that came from that as validation for our efforts, and actually used it in line, in the moment too, data that was coming in as validation. Tweets were skyrocketing, so we wanted to promote those. We worked, worked with teams to help disperse the content that we were doing based on what was proving to be successful in the moment. It was tough. It's like, I mean, I couldn't imagine a marketer doing that all the time. Like the amount of energy and resources that it takes to do something like that, especially around a big event, people would just have post-traumatic stress around marketing all the time, and like that's not what we want. It's fun to do it, once or twice for big events, but I think it's becoming more and more frequent now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think this is a clear example of really letting the consumers own the brand, so to speak, become part of the engagement and the experience, and that's fascinating.
Great. So I think this conversation around data and creativity, we think of them as these two sort of conflicting worlds, these two opposing worlds, and they can't possibly live together in a way that is exciting and interesting for us. And I think it's kind of the wrong way to look at it, but it's a truth, because there is a dark side, I think, to what Scott was alluding to getting too embedded with wanting to use the data to create sort of, so I think the apprehension from a creative point of view, and we kind of cheat by having Scott here because he does definitely embrace data as a creative. But I think the apprehension from a number of creative fields is that a lot of the data is being used in a way that creates a product that is potentially more, it's about repetition, it's about, ever more sort of, I'm seeing the same thing in just a slightly different hue than what I saw before. And the feeling is that if we continue to just produce more of what has worked in the past, it's going to get boring. We're not going to have these derivations. We're not going to have all these little deviations that bring new thinking and new ideas. So strategy and data have always sort of had a relationship. I mean, that's always driven sort of insights. We've always had a good part of that. But I think creativity in data is just we're just starting to see how we can use that as a creative catalyst. I think more creative eyes will be on how they can use data. Can, for instance, this year, the only new category in Can is a creative data lion, is going to be one of the only new categories. So I think that will get enough creatives' attention just by having that new category to submit awards in. There's this great quote here from...
we're also shallow or something.
There's this great quote here from Judy Woodruff on PBS NewsHour. So this paradox here is pretty well explained. It's like, they're listening. The music that we thought we were listening to is actually listening to us. And so this idea of the Shazam effect has been, you guys have probably heard of that. And that can be applied to a number of different fields. And that's to say, we can either use the data for good, we can use it to fuel creativity, or we can use it to make our product, ever more expected. So I think one example of showing how, and I tend to use this with a lot of creative people to say, I don't understand how data could ever be a part of the conversation on creativity or a big idea. And so this example that many of you may be familiar with on the next slide here is the example from British Airways. So this is an example of this execution would not even exist and come to life if it wasn't for data. So it's not consumer data. It was basically 4 key pieces of data from an airplane that came through. So it was the speed, it was the call sign, it was the flight number, which would have all of that data embedded into it in terms of where it's coming from. And these 2 billboards were sort of side by side in London, right by Heathrow. And so as a plane would fly over, they worked with Clear Channel actually to create a whole new media model. So they had to have interruptive media. So essentially there was another brand's advertisement there. British Airways ad would, as the plane was flying overhead, the ad would interrupt the ad that was on, and the kid would come over and say, look, it's flight BA 475 from Barcelona. And this was pretty interesting because it's interruptive, it gets your attention, and the execution, does not even work without having the data involved in that. So, Scott, I don't know if that's something you could comment on in terms of creatives, if you can get more inspiration when you see executions like this and what's possible using data that exists.
Yeah, this is really, ironically, I was talking about data as inspiration versus validation, and this is sort of validation of my point before, but, so now the whole thing just got really meta. But, so this, I think this is a great I think this is a great example of data driving inspiration. I think there are probably thousands and thousands of examples of that now, and it's only getting greater as those in creative disciplines embrace this thought. I've often said too, and it reminded me when we were talking about some of the data, and I was talking about the two ways to look at the data. Sabu can attest to this, at least when I was on the agency side, that I drove pretty hard on the analytics team, because I think we all fall victim to this sometimes, where relationships with clients and success measures that companies have, especially marketing companies working with large client structures, provides us to sort of prove success all the time. So we're predisposed to prove success of our pieces. And I used to drive really hard into those teams and join meetings that typically creatives didn't join. And I would say, well, I don't really want to know how successful the thing was. I want to know where I failed on the thing. Where did I not do it good enough in the piece? And I think that's where being honest enough to look for that sort of feedback and being comfortable enough with the type of work that you're doing to look for that sort of feedback is going to set marketers apart. Like you hear, a lot of people use catchphrases, which are actually great, more than catchphrases. I think they're sort of mantras, like failing fast, failing forward. And they become, you take them for granted a little bit now, like you hear so much of that, but there's really something special in those phrases, like the idea of learning from failure and testing and being comfortable with the work that we do, and embracing the fact that, like I said, these are little things that we're doing. So who cares if you fail on a little thing? Like if you fail on that little thing that you're doing, this little niche marketing piece, and you learn something from it to make the next piece even better than you can do, then aren't you really doing a much better service for your client at that point, than sort of trying to hit a home run with every single, we all want to hit home runs with every single piece of work that we do. Is that realistic? I don't think that is.
It's a great example of the marketing culture is not used to presenting failure.
No.
Much less celebrating it, right? Mm-hmm. As the head of marketing at AB InBev said, over my 30 years, I've never had one vendor of marketing ever present to me negative results. He's like, so therefore I don't trust any of the reported results. Right?
But I think that's more common than anybody would care to admit. Like, frankly, I think that the sort of polished results that we've all produced in the past, like for fear of failure, is probably more common than we would care to. Like I always insisted that we, put some red lines on that thing. Like show, if we made all of our benchmarks, if we pushed past all of our benchmarks and had a wild success, then maybe our benchmarks were wrong.
Yes, Scott, that's a really interesting point. And like you said, I think we work very closely together across analytics and creative. But I think what's interesting there is that analytics folks typically tend to have a very black and white definition of success, and creative folks typically tend to get emotionally attached to their work. And this is where I think the art of, or really the combination of art and science, in method, in testing and learning, becomes so critical because I think data is really the bridge to failing fast, right? Or kind of knowing when you failed, right, and learning from that process as you mentioned it, and really kind of creating that feedback loop. And I think the other point that you made, which was really critical, was kind of learning from those unexpected movements, actually. So sometimes data does point us in a direction where we might have new insights, and being willing to embrace that, I think, is really critical. Is a really critical part of the process overall. So I do think that the method really kind of drives the process as well.
Sabu, let me ask you a question. Do you feel as an analytics guy that all the factors that explain consumer engagement or just a person's engagement can be quantified and expressed as numbers, right?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Mike. I think it's a challenge that we actually grapple with. Because I think when we kind of think about lower funnel behaviors or engagement, for example, I think we can potentially quantify it because then I think we can model these behaviors to something like intent to purchase, for example. But it's much harder to kind of quantify how people feel, right? Especially against experiences and content. And it's hard to kind of really kind of then create a metric that you can optimize towards, right? I mean, and attitudinal data is slower, slower moving, right? People don't change attitudes in a flip, right? It's easier to measure clicks in some respects than measuring attitudes towards a brand. I mean, and that's kind of a fundamental challenge that we face, in fact.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this triggers an interesting thought. This particular campaign, it's a very recent campaign that Matt Solden is going to be talking about pretty soon here at 3:30 in another panel. I think in the content space, there is all sorts of things you can learn, as I said, because there's a lot of choice there, right? And so content that's created for brands in general who are much more interested in growth, they want to know whether their content is reaching beyond their core, most loyal audience, right? Because if you rely on just selling stuff to the same people who have always bought from you, there is not going to be much growth. And so frankly, how do you extend beyond? And I think the creation of content allows you to test. Are you able to grab additional pockets, to your point? Remember those niche segments and things who've never considered, your brand? Are they going to be more in tune with you because you are able to get their attention with this content, right? And this is an interesting example, and I don't know, Andy, if you were close to this thing, if you can speak to this one, what was the motivation behind it, and what was it trying to do beyond what it normally tries to do?
Right, so I think just to go back to your original point though, I think what all this sort of real-time understanding of where our content and our ideas are performing well or not performing well, we have this data, and what that begs for is for our other systems that are in place to adapt to that. So instead of having our buckets of media that are already planned out and all the channels that it's planned out for, we need to have something that, if you think about it, there are unexpected audiences that we need to almost surf as they gain attention with this content. So if we weren't expecting this audience to pick up this idea and it becomes very, very popular, how do you lean into that? Do we have the system in place? Do we have a budget in place so that we can fuel that even further? You have different audiences that are going to be engaging in it for different reasons as well. And so how do you then understand what it is about the content that it's actually appealing to them, which might be different? And then you can start to create derivative content, or you can start to really fuel that message and lean into that a bit more, and just think how much more effective that can be, to your point about the big idea versus a lot of smaller ideas. When this idea is live in the world, we can have hypotheses about how it's going to do against which audience, but a lot of times it's going to be unexpected. We're going to have good surprises, we're going to have some that we didn't expect, and if we don't have the ability in place to kind of lean into it and make it feel like we're listening and we're actually pushing it even further, then we're sort of just letting our content go out into the world and just hoping it lands in a good place, and we're not fueling it along as we go. So I think there's a lot that needs to happen in the media world to sort of take advantage and retool for these opportunities that we have.
One point on the media world you referred to, these like pre-planned buckets of investment that are sort of about the Mustang, or maybe creative concept for the Mustang, or about an F-150. Actually, Team Detroit did something really innovative with the concept of advertising endemic automotive properties. Traditionally, automakers do that by sort of allocating buckets by model. And what Team Detroit did, and we helped them to do this, is like, let's spin this around and see who the consumer is, and then choose which model, like sort of on the fly, is being advertised. So in other words, you should see the Mustang and I should see the F-150 based on who we are. And it doesn't get into the creative treatments, but it does get into this idea of, what if you didn't bucket out all the media planning in such a rigid way? What if it could be put into like sort of runtime memory and dispensed, at the speed of life based on the customer? Yeah. It's just a little example of like actually a very big thought that I think the industry hasn't punched through quite.
And I think when you think of it that way, it actually, you feel a bit more brave. I think your client, as well as the agency creating the content, I think you take more chances when you know that you can actually figure out how you can make it better when it's out in the world if it's not doing as well. Or you find an audience that you didn't expect and you can really lean into that. So I think it makes you take chances with your idea. So I mean, we can show a quick. So it's a super short trailer, but essentially,
You get the idea.
No, it's a great point made, and I think, Andy, I think that to sum up actually kind of this portion of the conversation, I think it's about adaptability and agility, right? Kind of learning, quickly, but also being able to react to new learnings, unexpected learnings, and even from a creative perspective, being able to evolve, to those learnings, essentially. So I think, really good discussion. I think that begs the question around, how should we engage with consumers? I mean, where are the learnings around, engaging and co-creating perhaps with consumers, but more importantly, perhaps, where is that ecosystem of value exchange between brands and consumers? Scott, I know you have some ideas about this.
I drew this, but and this should be pretty easy to understand for everybody. It's a Venn diagram, shows where we should concentrate and where the little man pushing the ball is what we're trying to do so much, and we should really be focusing on these overlap areas. I think maybe we should take some questions, though.
Let's do that.
Just curious, do you guys have any thoughts on how brands can protect themselves from jumping on every trend that big data says to do will resonate with consumers without losing core brand principles, the things that we work so hard to create?
Can I take a part of that? Are you referring to like, people jumping on, like in the social space, like jumping into like every hashtag, every trend, every calendar event, everything like that? I think is that where you're asking the question? So I think it's up to, the advice that I would give is that the brands need to be scrupulous about what they do. Like I think everybody, it's the allure of scale that comes with that. Like when something's happening and some giant event is happening, everybody wants to be relevant. Like everybody talks about relevance now, and relevance is important. But I think there's an element of it that we have to police ourselves, and by we, I mean brands and agents of those brands, who are working in that space. So we always try to ask, like, should we? I know we want to talk about this thing that's going right now, but should we talk about this thing? Does it make sense? I've seen so many examples, and I'm not going to list them because I don't want to be disparaging to any brands, but so many examples of brands just like leaning into things for almost no apparent reason, where it's just they're drawing these correlations in the conversation that they've had that are almost laughable. And some of them are so successful because they're laughable, almost. Like, again, it sort of flips at some point. But to give the example, back when we did the live tweeting around Super Bowl is one of those. It's like the pinnacle thing. Like when we did the live tweeting around the Super Bowl, like not this year, but last year, that the guidelines that I gave for the room, the creatives and the people working in the social space on the room was, I would expect us over the course of that game to produce 9 pieces of content, like single digits. Like we don't have to comment about every play. We don't have to do, and at some point you become obnoxious, I think, doing that when you do that as a brand. And I think it goes a long way to kind of dial that back a little bit, and that says something about your brand's values when you do that. I think people are savvy enough that they recognize it.
Yeah, another key point, there, I think, is we tend to look at topics that actually drive advocacy for the brand and actually are meaningful for the brand and where the brand benefits, and also where consumers are engaging actively. So I think knowing kind of where that intersection is, again, I think goes back to kind of some of Scott's idea here about what we want to tell people and what people want to actually hear from us, I think is really important to recognize there. Other questions?
I wanted to see if you guys could maybe talk a little bit about using data to create rich user experiences in the software world, because I think we've heard a lot about advertising and kind of marketing and kind of the edge audience in that space. And I know that I work in software, and I'm looking to, I guess I would just love your insights as far as how to use data in a software environment.
Yeah, I think we do a lot of work actually in user experience, right? From an app perspective, from a site perspective. And I mean, I think the same actually learnings apply to software. I think what we found is it's really important, apart from kind of doing user testing and focus groups around the user interface, for example, I think what's critical is to also kind of know what are some of the attitudinal barriers? I mean, why do people not take the next action, for example? Can't they find the most meaningful next action. In addition to the attitudinal drivers, I think it's also important to collect the behavioral data and combine it with the attitudinal data, so you can actually then start to dissect what are people doing and why are they doing or not doing what you want them to do.
I would say as a software company, we're using tools like New Relic or just looking at the same behavioral data and running constant experiments. This concept of like a design of experiments framework where we're going to ask our users some things, and then we're going to just test them on a bunch of other things, and then just sort of following the metrics where use and sort of workflows kind of start to accelerate, through changes. And I think the agile software sort of meme has definitely affected user interface design in a positive way. And it's the same thing. It's the log data coming out of the product that really tells you quite a bit.
We have probably one more. Gentleman over here.
Hey, great talk. In the same vein of the last point that you guys touched on, how are you taking the data that you've mined and pairing it with more empathetic user needs?
In my mind, that is, so there's a difference between, and we see this on a day-to-day basis, which is there's a difference between behaviors and what people actually feel, internally. And this, again, comes in, because when we look at the behaviors, we are on our site, for example, we're driving, actions that are indicative of purchase or sales. But without that attitudinal component, we wouldn't know how people actually feel about the experience. What is their satisfaction with the experience in the site? And is there even a resonance around the brand? So we typically tend to use both those data components, both the behavioral as well as the attitudinal piece, to actually kind of look at things like opinion, empathy, just resonance of the brand, and do they feel like the product is for somebody like them, essentially.
I'd like to add to that and say that some of the data sets that we have, I think there's an important aspect, and I don't know if this gets to your empathy question, but there's an important aspect of fiction in the data elements. Like, data is very factual based, and that's where it's a little bit of what I had always liked to do with the teams and with the strategy teams is if we have a bunch of data that paint a certain picture of someone, that helps us understand who that person is. But then there's always a hunch that we have on the creative side. There's always, and that goes back to my talk about automating creative. Like, it's that human element in what we do in creating our ideas that allows us to move forward. If we're only looking at analysis of what we're doing to measure success, then we're only looking backwards. And it's very hard to innovate or go in new directions when you're looking behind you and trying to walk forward. So that element of like the storytelling element, there are a lot of things that we do with ideas that aren't based in data. They're sort of driven by the data and inspired by the data, but they might be hypotheses that we throw out there that, because you're right, like everything that, the path that somebody leads, it might just be the only path that was available to them, not necessarily where they wanted to go.
Well, there's this, the data science term, for models that are brittle is overfitting. Like you've created this thing that answers all of the historical data. What it does is it unwittingly sort of blots out the discovery zone where things actually, meet humans and you discover new things. One approach to that in general, and again, it's very antithetical to the traditional ways of working, I think, is to work like a clinical trial would. I'm going to take a 5% and I'm just going to let it roam and I'm going to see what the data is telling me. So I'll have my going in thought, but I'll have a framework for sort of adapting on the fly to the periphery where it may be more relevant than I think. I think it's tough for people to work that way because we're trying to confirm or deny our big ideas still. And we get so vested in them that the idea of taking any amount of energy away from that is viewed as a threat.
All right, I think that's it. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
All right.